Hello and welcome to Carlson Tech Talks, a series of interviews with industry experts who will talk about the intersection of technology and business. Today, our guest is Mr. Kevin Kuhn. Kevin is currently a faculty member of the Carlson School, but prior to joining us, Kevin was a vice president of information technology at Optum and was responsible for leadership of the segment finance IT delivery for both United Healthcare and Optum Corporate. He was responsible for leadership of corporate IT capabilities for both enterprise administrative functions, including finance, human capital, as well as corporate departments like legal, treasury, audit, with the direct responsibility for corporate IT strategy, software development, change management, and operations of over 85 business applications. He has also been an executive in residence of the Carlson School and has served in various advisory boards of the Management Information Systems Department. And one interesting fact about Kevin is that he's also an accomplished writer of science fiction books with 2 publications to his name. So welcome, Kevin. Good to have you today.
Thank you, Samya.
So we have a couple of questions that the students have sent. So we are going to get started with those questions. The first one is really the obvious one, like what makes healthcare IT different? And to that, I'd add a question from a student who has asked, what are the typical strategic goals for healthcare IT? And how do you feel whether they are appropriately aligned and prioritized within the industry?
Okay. Let me take those one at a time. To start with the what's different about healthcare IT. I think it starts with the complexity. I was lucky enough to work in a lot of industries and, certainly never saw one as complex as healthcare. If you think about a healthcare transaction, like a claims transaction or something, there's so many entities that are involved. You have the patient, you might have their, a household member that actually has the insurance. You have obviously physicians, nurses, anesthesiologists, facilities, and then you have, the insurance itself. Many times the government is involved through Medicaid or Medicare, other things. So the transactions themselves are incredibly complicated, and that kind of sets up the overall complexity of healthcare IT. In addition, it is a supply chain, right? Which can get complicated in terms of, the providers, the health insurance, the pharmacists. So really, I think the major difference from my perspective is the complexity. So help me, the second half of that question.
The second one was what are the typical strategic goals for healthcare IT?
Yeah, I think for many years, the big goals across the whole healthcare chain has really been cost reduction. Cost reduction is what, the government's looking for, what patients are looking for. The challenge is that is, set against, what I would say is the overriding goal in healthcare, which is to, reduce human suffering and, provide, the best care possible. So the question kind of becomes, the best care at what price, So I think the overall system in healthcare has really kind of spent the last 5 years trying to work across the system, government, hospitals, health insurance, to really drive down cost without reducing care at all. So the big goals are, what you might expect, still having high quality, but there's really been that big push in trying to reduce costs.
And do you feel that there is appropriate alignment and prioritization of these goals within the industry?
It's complicated, right? Because at the time that care happens for you, right, personally, or your family member, right, suddenly money becomes no object, right? So it is tough to align the objectives across the whole health industry. The good thing about health insurance is health insurance companies are the one company that are really aligned to drive cost reductions, right? Again, hospitals and pharmacists, while on the ground doing the real work to serve patients, they aren't necessarily rewarded by lowering costs. So, many times it's up to the health insurance companies to try to take the lead on how do we still give efficient care, but reduce costs as well. So I think there's a lot more alignment, but I think it's just something as a system and as a society we have to keep working on to try to find that line between high quality care and reasonable costs.
And you mentioned about the complexity of the transactions, but we also have new emerging technologies that can address some of that complexity, or perhaps increase the back-end complexity as well, right? So one of the questions that a student had was, how have healthcare providers leveraged things like the Internet of Things or IoT trend to better track patient health data? Like, for example, whether physicians are now actively using data from patient medical devices or wearables to make more informed decisions and to improve patient outcomes. And if not, what's the kind of things that are impacting the adoption of these, or negatively impacting the adoption of these new technologies?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess I would start with a quote that is, the future is here, it's just unevenly distributed. So the answer to it is yes. There are many use cases where, devices, whether they be medical devices or exercise devices or whatever, where that data is being used by physicians, by even, companies and insurance companies trying to reward and support healthy behavior to keep people healthy, to reduce healthcare costs. So, and of course, you have, for many years, you've had things like, diabetes, or glucose monitoring, and other like implanted devices that companies have been gathering data for a long time to facilitate, treatment and diagnoses. So it's here. It's happening. It's happening. Kind of in many areas, and substantial advancements are going on every day. I would say it's just not consistent yet, right? It's not being used across the entire population, and it's not being used by all players in the insurance market. But progress is being made on a regular basis. Maybe I'll also kind of take that from a broader perspective. So if you look at the slides, if you can see the slides, there is a slide where I just kind of wanted to make a point that there is a lot of change that's going on in the insurance, really across all industries, but very much in healthcare. And if you look at that first slide, you can see that there's a lot of new technology, including some things that are, I think, really exciting for healthcare, like blockchain and IoT. But those capabilities, I think, are creating some really advanced trends in business and driving a lot of change. And the output of that is that it's really a new world for technology, right? It's creating, a different environment that technology needs to operate under. It's much more fast moving. There's a need for diversity. There's a need for kind of continuous learning, as well as, flatter, higher matrix, and an increasing global workforce. And all that also means that people's jobs are changing, right? We're seeing more of this gig economy, where people are playing different kinds of roles, working from home, having shorter term roles. So all of these kind of trends that are happening simultaneously are really driving a big change, not only the industry, but also to how IT works.
So can you tell us a little bit about, like, how does technology-driven decision-making happen in large organizations, especially ones with the complexity of the healthcare domain?
Yeah. complexity in healthcare is substantial. There's a lot of regulation. Like we already talked about how complex the transactions are. It's probably one of the most complex environments overall. And with really large companies in technology, the reality is the decisions happen all over the company, right? They can't obviously all be made, at the top. So, but it does start with kind of principles. It does start with leadership, and it does start with really good governance. So really large companies have to work hard on building really rich, robust governance models that really help the broader organization make consistent decisions and all decisions that kind of support the overall strategy. One way to think about it, if you look at the slides, is, if you're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's really that kind of the same thing exists in technology. You have kind of these layered needs that start with some very basic things, like our systems have to keep running, right? We have to have highly available systems that are meeting the basic needs. But at the same time, the business and customers are looking for cost reductions. They're looking for new opportunities, and they're also kind of looking for innovation. But none of those can happen without the basic things happening. So one way that governance and kind of management models work in big complex organizations is to kind of organize around that structure and to kind of keep reminding people that yes, we want to do innovation, but we still have to do all the blocking and tackling successfully and at a high quality of level. You have to meet those basic needs before you can kind of move up that chain.
And do you see this being practiced well in most of the organizations in this sector?
In healthcare? Again, it's, I think what was maybe a little bit of a surprise over the last 5 to 7 years was just the complexity of security,
right?
And how difficult that would be to manage. So I think that's the one area where a lot of companies are still playing catch up and kind of scrambling to manage the information security as a enterprise capability.
So what's changing in the healthcare IT sector?
I think the biggest thing is really change itself. The pace of change is increasing so much that it's really driving a different way of working. Companies have to be much more matrixed. Companies have to be much more agile. The regulation is changing. There's new entrants that are coming in. All these trends around IoT and machine learning and artificial intelligence are creating a massive amount of opportunity. So, the biggest thing I think for IT organizations in healthcare is kind of managing that pace of change. And how do you still do, the transactional work well, but how do you support all this innovation and be open to, kind of a fast change like startups have.
Right. So in terms of managing all these complexities, as well as integrating new technologies and the opportunities that these technologies can create, an organization needs a thought leader, somebody with a vision of bringing those IT capabilities and integrating it with the rest of the organization. And so I know you have a few ideas about the role of a CIO. So if you could tell us a little bit about what, in your opinion, makes a good CIO in today's technology-driven industries.
Yeah, well, the role of CIO is really changing, and particularly at a company like UnitedHealth Group, Optum. There's really a large leadership team. So when I talk about kind of the role of CIO, it's often not just one person. It's kind of the whole technology leadership team. But I'll advance to the next slide because I kind of think it sets it up. So, there's a lot of roles that I think, maybe some aspect of them have been around for a while, but really kind of they're changing now, and it's much more demanding. So just kind of hitting on the list, I think it starts with the CIO as kind of an innovation champion, right? I mean, historically, CIO's role was more about reducing risk. So innovation was, carefully controlled. Now I think just to keep up with, competitors and opportunities, I think, CIOs really need to be innovation champions. Going on from there, CIOs often were kind of off to the side from the business and really kind of order takers, whereas today they really need to be at the table and part of, so much of, you hear so many companies talking about they are either a technology company or they are a data company. What that really means is that the CIO needs to be there at the table setting business strategy along with, finance and operations and all the other departmental needs. So a third change is really CEO as venture capitalist. There's so much opportunity today in terms of what can happen because of all these trends, big data, Internet of Things, machine learning. I mean, there's just a huge set of opportunities. What the other big role that the CIO really has to play is where do we place our bets? Of all of these opportunities, which one has the potential to do the most good for our customers or, patients or whatever, which ones are going to be winners, and, how do we make the right investments? So the CIOs and the IT leadership teams really kind of have to think as like venture capitalists and really think about, making good investments. And also realizing maybe that not every investment is going to succeed like a venture capitalist would.
And this requires the CIO to be informed about the technology trends as well as like how the technologies work in order to make a good decision, right?
Exactly. They have to understand all of those opportunities and which ones are, higher risk and which ones are more likely to succeed. Yeah. So the third one, I think, is, or fourth, sorry, is CIO as a quality devotee. Again, with particularly in healthcare, right? Quality is huge. I mean, the potential implications of having mistakes in healthcare, can be catastrophic in terms of, what may happen to, patients and things like that. So even with all this change and even with all the opportunity to do things differently, in the end, quality still has to be number one. There just, there can't be mistakes. You can't have breach of data.
The Equifax that matters.
Yeah. But the cost of that
Right.
today with HIPAA and everything is just enormous. And there just has to be a real embrace of kind of quality management as a discipline, because there's just no room these days to have significant quality issues. So that's another area. And then probably the last one is to do all these other things, you need talent, right? You can't do any of those things if you don't have talent in your organization. So, and particularly top talent is hard to get and hard to keep. So the CIOs and the leadership teams really have a kind of a new role in both being magnets to attract that talent, and then also put things in a position so that they can keep talent and continue to give opportunity and to give rewards to top talent. So overall, the role of CIO is really changing, and it's really challenging, I think, in this current environment.
And what would you say are the best qualities that make a good CIO?
Well, I think it starts with leadership. People that are not afraid to, to take the lead, to take, reasonable risks, and to kind of question the status quo of the system, and also really someone that is really going to lead the organization, because it's hard work these days in technology, particularly in healthcare, where it's so complicated and everything is changing so fast and there's so much regulation. That leadership is really important. And then, as you pointed out earlier, IT leadership really has to understand these new trends. So I think another thing that really makes a good CIO is somebody who's curious, somebody who's always open and interested in kind of what's possible and how things can be done better. So those are probably like the most important traits, I would say.
So you mentioned earlier that like prioritization is very complex in the healthcare sector. So can you give us an example of what that might look like?
Sure. Yeah. Prioritization becomes, when we talked about CIO as a venture capitalist, right? There's, you have to invest in the current capabilities. You have to look for new opportunities, and you have to find ways to be innovation. And that means there's a big fight for capital in companies. I think I have a slide. So it gets complicated, right? We talked about that you have to have good principles and that you have to have a good governance structure in place, because the decisions end up being decentralized and they happen, all over the company. But even with that, you have to have a fairly complex structure in place. So I'm not going to walk through this, but just to give you an idea of how complicated the decision process to decide, on a regular basis, where are we going to make our investments, what things have to get done. I mean, it's really hard. It's one of the hardest things in IT is how do you make sure you're funding the right projects, that you're balancing, the maintenance work with the blocking and tackling projects with innovation and other opportunities. So it's as complicated as this slide might look.
So we have one question from a student who is asking, how can they, as students, prepare to support the future organizational strategic goals in this healthcare space from different departments within healthcare?
Okay. So, I think probably one of the best ways to do that is to really be a systems thinker, really think in terms. So it's really easy in technology to kind of get focused on technology itself, right? The tools, the new gadgets, things like that can provide improvements in technology. But anytime we do any programs, any new capabilities, it's always about kind of the entire system. I think there's a slide. So here's a slide that kind of would help you think about systems thinking. So, we always have to start with strategy and how does these individual components fit within the broader strategy. But then, it's not just about the tech. It is about the technology, but it's not just about the technology. We also have to think about people. We have to think about process and really make sure we think through, process seems easy until you start to think of exceptions and, all the things that can possibly go wrong. So we have to really think about exceptions, and being able to think broadly about the system in general and not just the technology, I think is what really differentiates people that can really help drive good change and success in technology. It's kind of that broader mindset of thinking from a system standpoint and not just a tactical technology viewpoint.
At this time, we'll just check if there are any questions online. So I think, so those are the main questions that we had from the students. So thank you very much, Kevin, for giving us a great overview of the healthcare IT domain and the kind of challenges that are existing there, but also the opportunities with technology and what kind of a role a good CIO or future leaders can play in these organizations in shaping the strategy, in particular the IT strategy. So thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us today.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.